Yeah. I guess I bet that's you as well.
Rachel, can I double check that you can see the slides at your end on the screen? Yeah, great. I think we'll make a start now. A warm welcome to everyone, both online and in person. Thank you for joining us today for the British Society of Criminology Hate Crime Network and Policing Network, a joint conference on hate crime perpetrators, the effectiveness of criminal justice responses. My name is Irene Zempi. My pronouns are she, her, and I am absolutely thrilled to host this joint event by the two networks. I'm sure you have a copy of our program. We have a fantastic lineup of speakers, including the chairs of the two networks. Our plenary speaker, Professor John Garland. Also fantastic papers in our first panel, motivations, context, and typologies of offending, as well as in panel 2, responding to hate crime offending. So overall, the aim of this conference is to shed light on the motivations of hate crime perpetrators, but also the effectiveness of criminal justice responses. We aim to finish around 4 so that we have enough time for people to travel home or have lunch or dinner later on if you are staying over in Nottingham. Some additional information, it is also noted in your program. We have booked 3 quiet rooms, so 1701, 1706, and 1708. These rooms are down the corridor, so very close to the room that we are in. So if at any point you need to have a break, events can sometimes be a bit overwhelming, so feel free to use any of the breakout rooms at any point you like, the quiet rooms. Also, unfortunately, we don't have non-binary toilets, and this is common in the older buildings on the sitting campus. However, we are using the disabled toilets as non-binary, so feel free to use the disabled toilets. And finally, we have multi-faith facilities on city campus. This is based in the DICE building, so please let me know if you need guidance. It's very, very close to where we are. Also, we do not expect any fire alarm tests. So if there's a fire alarm, it's likely to be, real rather than a test. Hopefully not. But in that case, our meeting point will be the entrance of Chaucer building. So thank you for listening. I will now hand over to the chair of the Hate Crime Network, Dr. Rachel Keighley. Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everyone, and good morning. Welcome. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to this year's conference, co-hosted between the Hate Crime Network and the Policing Network for the British Society of Criminology. Thank you for joining us, whether in person and to those online as well. I'll look down there, you're up there, sorry. For what we hope is going to be a thought-provoking, challenging and empowering day. As Irene said, my name is Dr. Rachel Keighley. I'm the chair of the Hate Crime Network and my pronouns are she, they. I want to start by thanking Dr. Irene Zempi for organising today's conference and for all the work she has put in behind the scenes. Thank you so much. It's been brilliant already, all the work you've done. And so I just wanted to start before we get into the theme of today's conference by just giving a little bit of background information about the Hate Crime Network and the Policing Network. So on the screen now, you've got the contact details for the email addresses of myself and my Deputy Chair, Mikhail, who is over there if he gives a wave to everyone in the room. We've also got the new Chair of the Policing Network, Alexandra Nayag, here as well. So if you have any questions about the Policing Network, direct them that way. The QR code on screen is to sign up to the Hate Crime Network's mailing list. So we do a bi-monthly newsletter, which just keeps you up to date with all of our various events and news as well. So if you do want to sign up, it is free. I promise I won't spam you. It is bi-monthly. And we're also both on X and LinkedIn, and the Hate Crime Network is on Blue Sky. So you've got the X handles at the bottom there, but you can follow us on LinkedIn as well. Again, happy to share those if you need as well. So in terms of the aims, the Hate Crime Network aims to share information about hate crime with a view to challenging and developing a critical analysis across the realms of research, policy and practice. And we want to advance the understanding of hate crime, both in the national and the international context. We also aim to foster opportunities for collaborating and networking. So hopefully you'll have plenty of opportunities to do that today. In terms of the policing network, their aims are to bring together researchers, policymakers and practitioners who are interested in better understanding the contemporary issues relating to policing. So again, more information, please do ask any of us. I just wanted to give a brief sort of breakdown of some of the events that the networks host. So obviously this conference is part of an annual series of conferences that we host as a hate crime network. And this year, obviously, we're co-hosting with the policing network. We also have a variety of PGR and ECR online events. We have a podcast, which is available on, I think, all of the podcast platforms. We have online writing groups, and we also have a writing prize as well. And the policing network are looking for new committee members. So they're looking for a conference liaison officer, an early career researcher lead, and an events and workshop lead. So if you are interested, we'll pop the email address of Alex in the chat for those online, or you can go and speak to her here in person today if you are interested in joining their network. And just to plug a little bit of work, this is by no means all the work happening within the field, but this is just some of the work happening in the field of hate crime. So I'm part of the Rural Racism Project at the Centre for Hate Studies at the University of Leicester. So that work is looking at challenging the urban-centric lens of looking at racism by looking at racism in rural spaces, which is obviously routinely overlooked, minimised, and is really going unchallenged within the English countryside. So we're in the process of sharing some reports on that, as well as some webinars. So all this information will go out through the Hate Crime Network and will be on the Centre for Hate Studies website if you do want to know more. Another colleague, David Wilkin, who's down at the front here, he might give you a wave, is also working on focusing on the lived experience of autistic people encountering the criminal justice system. And this is as suspects, victims and witnesses. So evidence so far shows that autistic people are not being taken seriously. They're being pressured into accepting a caution and a criminal record rather than receiving a full investigation. And this work is ongoing. So if you're interested, again, I'm sure David will be more than happy to share a little bit about that work with you. And then finally, within more of the theme of this conference today, there is a book coming out in September, right, Irene? Hopefully, TBC. It's the first of 2 edited collections looking at hate crime perpetrators. And there's been some fantastic contributions by various academics looking at new perspectives from theory, research and practice. And this has been edited by John Garland, Irene, Zempi and Joe Smith, who unfortunately cannot be with us today, but should hopefully be a fantastic book. And I don't say that just because I've got a chapter in there. It genuinely is brilliant work. So hopefully when that comes out, you can all engage with that as well. So now thinking a little bit more about the theme of today's conference. So I just wanted to set the scene before I welcomed our first speaker. So we're meeting at a time of heightened hostility. The current social and political climate, both across the UK and globally, I think demands urgent and sustained attention from all of us working in the fields of criminology, policing, criminal justice and advocacy and activism. I think we're witnessing a surge in political rhetoric, and public sentiment that emboldens hate and is undermining social cohesion. We've seen the rise of far-right movements in the UK, across Europe and further afield. And these have increasingly entered the mainstream, normalising racism, misogyny, disableism, anti-LGBTQ+ sentiment and other forms of hate under the guise of free speech or populist discontent. And I think it's in this context that the growing influence of parties like Reform UK cannot be ignored. What might once have been deemed fringe ideologies are now shaping national debate and local policy making. And I think the shift is having real material consequences on people's lives, on their safety, and on their sense of belonging. So I really wanted to take a moment to start by acknowledging the deeply polarised and painful context surrounding this conference. In recent weeks, and indeed years, we've seen escalating hostility, for example, directed at trans and gender non-conforming people, at migrants and refugees whose humanity is repeatedly undermined, and at disabled people whose rights are being eroded through punitive policies that restrict their access to basic support and benefits. And these are just a few examples. And I argue that these patterns of marginalisation are not disconnected. They're rooted in systems that devalue life and are silencing dissent. So against this backdrop, today's conference is more vital than ever. Our theme, centred on hate crime perpetration and responses, is not just timely, but necessary. We're hoping to understand the drivers, ideologies, and systems that enable hate. And we're hoping to be able to develop a better informed and more effective responses, whether that's from law enforcement, to education, to criminal justice responses and community intervention. So our panels today are bringing together leading voices in these fields of hate crime scholarship and policing and practice. We'll be hearing a little bit about typologies of offending, criminal justice responses, emerging trends, and lessons learned both domestically and internationally. Crucially, I think we'll also consider the role of structural power and how hate crime is not just arising in a vacuum, but it's reflecting deeper societal inequalities and exclusions. So whether you're here as a researcher, a practitioner, a policymaker, a member of the police, or just an interested community member, welcome. Thank you so much for being here today. We hope today leaves you not only better informed, but more connected and determined. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to welcome our first speaker of the day, Professor John Garland from the University of Surrey. He's conducted extensive research into hate crime, so I'm going to read this now so I don't miss anything off. So he's conducted extensive research into hate crime, policing, prisons, far-right groups, racism in rural and isolated context, racism, anti-racism and disorder in football, and he's published 6 books and numerous. He's on our steering committee for the British Society of Criminology Hate Crime Network, and he undertakes equality and diversity work across the prisons, across the male, female and youth estates. Today, John's plenary is going to be answering the question, developing an understanding of hate crime perpetration and criminal justice responses. Where are we now? So welcome, John. The floor is yours.
Rachel, can I double check that you can see the slides? Perfect, thank you.
Brilliant, excellent. Well, hello everybody. It's really nice to see you, and well said, Rachel, as well on a lot of those things. We do live in very difficult and troubled times, so I think this event is really timely. And so a huge thank you as well for those who've organised today and who've invited me to do the plenary. As Rachel mentioned, I'll be talking about those sorts of issues. Basically, how do we understand hate crime perpetration and what sort of interventions might we then put in place once we understand a sort of profile of hate crime perpetrators. And this talk is actually based on a chapter in the aforementioned book, second plug of the day. And so I really must acknowledge the contribution of my 2 co-authors, Derek Jolliffe and Ian Brunton Smith. This came about, this chapter, indeed this work came about because Ian and Derek, I don't know if you know their work, but they are sort of quants heavy criminologists. And I'm a qualitative researcher. So I've never ventured into the world of sort of quantitative criminology before. But they were wondering, I think their research in the past mainly focused on things like, Ian doing sort of, multi-level modelling on court statistics and things like that. Derek is a life course criminologist. But they became themselves, I think, interested in what they could do in the world of hate crime. And indeed, I was interested in the approach that they could take. And so both of them have done a lot of work in those sorts of areas. I can't really pretend to be a quants expert. So, I bring hopefully the hate crime knowledge to their quantitative specialisms. And what we decided to do was to look at hate crime offenders and especially patterns of reoffending using their very clever multi-level modelling quants techniques. Now, of course, those of you involved in the study of hate crime will know that, generally speaking, what Ben Bowling has said all those years ago is true to a degree, in that perhaps hate studies has focused predominantly on victims, and victimology, quite rightly, I think, in many ways. And what Ben said all those years ago was basically what we really need to do is understand offenders as well. So he talks about their relationship with those they victimise, the social milieu in which anger, aggression, hostility and violence are fostered, social processes by which violence becomes directed against minority groups. And he goes on to say, in some ways quite damningly, criminologists operate with scant evidence about what is going on in the lives of these people. Instead, we have only a devilish effigy for symbolic sacrifice. So in other words, basically what he was saying, and of course it was a while ago, was that we need more work in this area. It's convenient for us, and especially I think for those involved in hate studies, to say hate offenders are those people, those demonised others. They're different from us. But of course, are they? It doesn't mean that there hasn't been work in the area of hate crime perpetration. Of course there has. There hasn't been much quantitative stuff. But nevertheless, there has been some, and this is a very broad summary of these particular pieces of work. And of course, if you go into them, they're much more nuanced than this, as those of you will be aware. So there's been a bit of work in hate crime perpetration. Paul Agansky's work, really important and influential, I think, because he talks about how hate crime offenders are basically ordinary people, ordinary members of the public. They aren't this demonised other sort of skinhead, violent, far right people. Although of course those people are very important. They're part of this debate. He was saying hate crime seems to be typically committed by ordinary people in the course of everyday actions. And then criticised in some ways, but it's very useful. Probably the one you see cited the most in the area of hate studies is McDevitt et al.'s work, their study of 169 Boston police records, trying to understand, well, can we look at hate crime perpetrators? Is there a sort of typology that we can develop? And the interesting thing, I think, about their work was that they very prominently said that mission offenders, i.e. those that have a sort of hate ideology, those that might be members of far-right groups, only make up a tiny percent of hate crime offenders. I think in their work, it's something like 1% or something, or actual mission offenders of the 169 people that they looked at. And predominantly they said that those that are hate crime perpetrators do it for the thrill. It was something like 2/3 of the records that they studied were thrill offenders, people who do it out of boredom, people who aren't motivated necessarily by sort of far-right ideology or even hateful ideology. They do it for the thrill of it, because they're bored. And of course, there must be some sort of bias in there somewhere for them to enact a hate crime. But nevertheless, interesting work, certainly got me thinking. And then these various other pieces of work, quant stuff well worth looking at, broadly speaking, found that hate crime perpetrators, predominantly Wales, predominantly male and white, generally aged under 30, as you might think, are not mission offenders. And many had prior convictions for non-hate offences. And this is what we're talking about today. So we're referring especially to Jolliffe and Farrington's work. This is where Derek Jolliffe got interested in the whole hate crime perpetrators world. Him and David Farrington were just trying to get an idea of who it is that commits hate crime through their study of 38,000 or so records. I'll refer to that a little bit more in a second. And so when I was talking to Ian and Derek about this work, before we started, I think Derek Jolliffe is a life course criminologist and somebody who hadn't really looked at the world of sort of hate crime before. He approached it slightly differently, and he was saying, well, from his work with David Farrington, are hate crime offenders basically just prolific offenders who have a history of offending, of which their hateful offending is but a small part of their spectrum of overall offending. And of course, that then makes us think about, approaches to policing hate crime offenders, interventions as well. Are we misunderstanding this? What Derek and David Farrington were sort of tentatively suggesting, or are hate offenders actually specific hate offenders, those that do have some sort of prejudice, bias, and it motivates a large proportion of their offending. So are they bias motivated offenders, or are they basically people with a long history of offending, of which hate offending is just but a small part? So the sort of thing that was driving our thinking on this, that's Derek. And so for the chapter in the book and what I'm talking about today, this is the sort of thing that we're going to investigate. So it was, do hate crime offenders released from short-term incarceration different from non-hate crime offenders in their prevalence, frequency, or speed of reoffending? Talk a bit more about the data we looked at in a second. To what extent is the prevalence of the reoffending of hate crime offenders and non-hate crime offenders in line with their predicted reoffending using actuarial risk assessment tool? It's a new thing to me. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. And then, do those types of offenders, hate crime offenders, non-hate offenders, differ from each other in the profile of the type of their reoffence? So we're looking especially at reoffending patterns and what we could learn from those. And that's Ian. So the data that they managed to get hold of course, they've had a whole career of doing this, so they're very expert in getting this data and doing this sort of clever quant stuff on it. Is PNC data, and it's based upon, again, there's lots of caveats in this talk, and this is the first of them. It's data based on complete record of males who were released from prison in a calendar year, who were convicted of an offence for which their sentence was 1 year or less. So we're talking about a group of offenders here. They were convicted, sentenced to prisons for 1 year or less, and then we looked at all of those that were released within a calendar year. And what that looked like was that less than 1% of those had an index offence for hate, 355, and 38,244 non-hate offenders. So as I mentioned, the short-term thing, sentenced to 1 year or less. Data also included information about the type, timing, number of reoffences that were committed 12 months after the individual was released from prison. So it gave us something to go on. As far as I'm aware, there hasn't been a study like this, a quant study of hate crime reoffenders before. But of course, there are caveats. And for me, in the past, I very much respect quantitative criminology, of course, but I've always sat in talks like this and thought, but hold on a minute, So this is part of the, but hold on a minute, part of it. It only captures the behaviour, of course, of a very specific type of hate crime offender. And it doesn't capture all these sorts of other things, those that weren't recognised as being hate offenders by the victim, they weren't reported or recorded by the police, or those that got a community sentence or received a prison sentence of longer than a year. So with all of that in mind, this is the group that we're looking at. So bear that in mind when we sort of go on to throw some questions in the air about, how much we can read into this. But hopefully there's something here that is, particularly towards the end of the talk, there's something that cropped up in the data that we found really interesting. So hopefully you will too, and I'll be interested to hear your views on it. Right, another danger of these types of talks is that, again, when I'm lucky enough to have gone to the American Society of Criminology conference, which is very quants heavy, and I've sat in talks where there's just table after table of stats, and I'm thinking, oh, what can I read into this? It's all a bit too much. I'm about to do exactly the same thing. So apologies for that, but we'll be highlighting the bits that you need to know. I don't know if the slides are going to be circulated after, Irene, I don't know if there's a plan to, but excellent, because it's then that you can then sort of digest this in much more length, hopefully, and see some other things put out. So I'm just going to highlight a few things of note. And one is this sample here. Look at that. This includes all of it: hate crime offenders, non-hate crime offenders, with previous offences and with previous court appearances, almost 96% on both. So we're talking really prolific offenders here. With previous incarceration, 77%. So what an interesting history of offending. Then all sorts of other stats here. I could have highlighted any number of them, really. Average number of previous offences almost 44. Again, we're talking about prolific offenders. I hadn't really thought about hate offenders necessarily in this way before. Average number of previous incarcerations, 7.4. So it's a funny profile, isn't it? A really interesting profile. And thinking of Derek Jolliffe's initial thoughts about this, that these, hate crime offenders are sort of, career offenders, of which hate crime is just part of their broader offending. You can sort of see the angle that he was coming from when you see these sorts of statistics. And then the index offences of those that we looked at, again, there's a huge amount there. You obviously can't digest all of that at this particular moment. But it's worth highlighting perhaps those. So again, this is the whole population that we looked at, including the non-hate crime offenders as well. Almost 1 in 2 had been convicted for a year or less for theft or violence offences. So just interesting to see the broader profile of these sorts of people. So almost 1 in 2 had theft or violence convictions. And the ones we're especially interested in, those of us that are specialist hate crime scholars anyway, are the ones I've highlighted in red, how the police national computer characterises those offences: hate criminal damage, hate public order, hate violence, hate serious violence. All of which is, small numbers here, but still interesting, I think, still worth looking at. And you see that hate violence is the biggest one of those. So our total population that we looked at was around about 38,500, of which just shy of 1% was actual hate offenders. So all sorts of other stuff there, and do digest that, at your leisure. Right, then looking at reoffending of hate crime offenders and non-hate crime offenders. And there are some similarities, lots of similarities. And again, it's lots of data here. We can't look at all of it in this one particular go. But reoffending rates, as we scan down those 2 columns there, hate crime offenders on the left, non-hate crime offenders on the right, very similar. So reoffending rates, very similar. Days to reoffence, again, similar as well. So there's lots of similarities between our, hate offenders and our non-hate offenders when we're looking at reoffending. And then just one of the little quirks, I'm not sure what to make of this, just interesting, I think, if nothing else. When we look at the reincarceration rates, slightly higher for the non-hate crime offenders. So despite similar, reoffending rates and that sort of thing, slightly higher reincarceration rates for the non-hate offenders. And then this is where it gets clever, and when I start to scratch my head a little bit, this is when the modelling really does come in. And this is Derek and Ian's work. Do you know about the offence group reconviction score? Yeah, so some of you do, very familiar with this sort of thing. So basically what it is it's a Ministry of Justice sort of risk assessment tool type thing, when they look at things like gender, index offence, age, and sort of criminal history and time to the next offence, to produce something that sort of predicts likelihood of reoffending within a year. I think that's right. Something like that. Use it all the time. Great. And Derek and Ian tell me, it's useful. It's a rule of thumb. So again, it's not actually taken as gospel, but it's useful, helpful as a rule of thumb. And so basically what we've got in the table is, if you just scan down those columns there, hate crime offenders, reoffending rates, non-hate crime offenders, and their reoffending rates as well, grouped together or controlled by this OGRE score, this risk assessment tool here. So in other words, as we scan across the rows, we can look at the low risk, or those that are considered to be low risk of reoffending, across that top row there for hate crime offenders compared against non-hate crime offenders. And then we go down and we see the medium risk, the medium to high, and the high. So it's interesting. Especially, I think, when we start to drill into it, there's just 1 or 2 little quirks here. For those that are categorised as having a low risk of reoffending, across that top row there, as you can see, for hate crime offenders, 39% roughly, reoffended within a year, against 27% of the non-hate crime offenders. Why is there that difference? That's an interesting one. It certainly caught our eye when we were looking at this. More likely to reoffend if you're categorised as a low-risk hate crime offender against the low-risk non-hate crime offenders. Might be worth drilling into, perhaps. Something interesting there. Then as well, when we look at the average number of reoffences for hate crime offenders against non-hate crime offenders, we see that those categorised as medium to high risk of reoffending and high risk of reoffending, so we scan across there, the average numbers of re-offences committed, higher for the hate crime offenders. So they're committing, when they reoffend, they're committing more offences. Certainly in those two categories, if we can trust this risk assessment tool. So as Irene was saying to me, rule of thumb, caveat it, this isn't gospel, but it's interesting, I think. It might at least be sort of, thought-provoking, something that we can look at and discuss. So something interesting going on in that table, perhaps. Some differences in the profile of hate offenders versus non-hate offenders. And then, this is the last of the tables, you'll be relieved to know, huge amount of stuff here, so do digest at your leisure, and obviously feel free to drop me an email once you've looked at it. Types of reoffending. So if there seems to be a hint that hate crime offenders are doing more offences when they do reoffend than non-hate crime offenders, what are they up to? What are they actually doing? And so again, we've got a column there for the hate crime offenders, column there for the non-hate crime offenders. And there are one or two interesting things, I think, that are worth dwelling on, and particularly for those like Derek Jolliffe, that sort of life course criminologists, and view this slightly differently, perhaps, from those that do hate studies more generally. There's something in there that certainly, piqued his interest as well. So we're looking at hate crime reoffences for our particular population, those that have been incarcerated for a year or less and then released over that year-long period. Of course, we are looking at relatively small numbers here, but it might be the case when we look at the hate crime reoffence types, look at hate public order and hate violence. They're significantly higher than for non-hate crime offenders. So when hate crime offenders are reoffending, they're doing more specific hate offences. Again, what can we read into that? There is something there, perhaps. Are they, going back to the very first point, specialist hate offenders? That might hint at that. So we have hate offenders who are reoffending, and they keep reoffending with hate offences, which may indicate they are not part of this, the way that Derek was thinking about it, this sort of broad spectrum of just sort of general prolific offenders, but there's something about their bias that keeps motivating them to commit more hate crimes. It could be that. Or are they just prolific offenders anyway? Who reoffend in the categories that might make them more likely to commit a hate crime offence. So it's almost like the other way round of thinking about it. And if you read the Jolliffe and Farrington 2020 article I mentioned at the beginning, this is sort of when they were just looking, not at reoffending, but just offending, this is the sort of thing that they were really pondering on and thinking about. So in other words, our offenders are hate crime offenders. They're reoffending in those sorts of, public order related things, criminal damage, violence, serious violence. And the argument goes, because they're so prolific in that pattern of reoffending, almost inevitably, one of them is going to be a hate related offence, because they keep reoffending over and over again in the sort of categories where you can commit a hate offence and where a hate offence is registered. And they're less likely to do those sorts of offences that don't have that hate element, like theft or motoring offences or things like that. So is it just that they are prolific offenders? How much bias do we read into their offending? And for me, as somebody who's obviously had a look at these sort of issues before, but approached it very much from, I suppose, from a sort of hate studies viewpoint of thinking, yes, these are hate offenders. They have bias, they have prejudice. This is what motivates them. And of course, it may well do. And then hearing other viewpoints that, if you're thinking about interventions, effective interventions, should we, if we're trying to, in the policing world, work out the profile of the perpetrators, or if we're involved in probation, something like that, or delivering intervention programs, should we not specialise in having hate elements in those, but instead just addressing the prolific offending angle? And if you can address the prolific offending, you will tackle the hate bit. So it's a way that I hadn't really thought about it before. And certainly for me, it was very thought-provoking. And I was thinking, have I got this wrong all of these years? And that was certainly the initial conclusions that Jonathan Farrington came to. But, and this is where things get hopefully a little bit more interesting. This is Ian Brunton Smith's work on the same set of data. Before in one of the tables showed, we controlled for the risk of reoffending, using that risk assessment tool. And there's that table we could compare low risk offenders from the two different groups. Ian decided to create a model matching many more aspects of the profiles of the offenders. So matching hate crime offenders and non-hate crime offenders based on things like gender, age, index of offence type, history of prison, types of offence, time to charge, etc. Lots and lots of different, so a really sort of complex statistical model controlling for all these, trying to match hate offenders against non-hate offenders. And what he found was, that they almost all of that big group match. So they're very similar. Profiles of hate offenders and non-hate offenders are all, across all those range of things, are pretty similar. But he found of those 355 hate offenders, you see there are 105 that couldn't be matched. Almost like a rogue group of offenders that didn't match the profile of other hate offenders or of the non-hate offenders. And what he found was they tend to be older, this group, more likely to commit a range of offences, much more likely to reoffend, and more likely to commit hate offences. So this rogue group that can't be matched, 71% reoffend, you see there, compared to 57% of those of hate crime offenders that could be matched to the non-hate offenders. 54% of those matched non-hate crime offenders. The same there, 9.3% hate reoffence compared to 3.5% of the matched hate offenders, and even much smaller one of the non-hate crime offenders. There was also, Ian Brunton Smith was suggesting, evidence of more serious offending too. So there's something I was thinking, well, is there then this different group, this almost like quirky rogue group of hate crime offenders? What's driving them? More serious history, committing more hate offences, they're older. Now, is there a group out there that is a persistent hate reoffending group that is driven more by bias, that isn't just a type of hate offender that's so prolific that you can almost explain away that hate offending is an inevitable part of a massive history of offending? Is there something different? Now, intriguingly, Ian Brunton Smith, he was seconded to the Ministry of Justice for a year and a half. And as a real, because he's absolute elite level quants person. I can only hint at this, we can't talk about it yet, but he's been analysing 11.3 million records, court records, comparing hate offenders against non-hate offenders. We can't publish anything about it and can't give a paper on it as yet, but he is finding this on a much bigger scale, that there's this odd rogue group of hate offenders that can't be matched. So watch this space, let's see what we can come up with. And so just wondering, I suppose, well, what do we read into this? Do we go down that route of, looking at people's prolific offending history and seeing where the hate fits within that? Or is there actually out there this specialist group that therefore does need specialist hate-related interventions? It's a profile of hate offender that is different and that really needs our attention. Okay, right, I shall finish there. the idea really was to, prompt some sort of thought, hopefully sort of debate and discussion. So we're really interested to hear your views on our sort of very tentative conclusions. Okay, thank you.
Sharing slides and stop recording as well, so we can have Q&A. In the meantime, shall we have maybe 2 questions from the online space and maybe 2 from, the room, and then we can have maybe 5-10 minute break for tea, coffee, and